I'm Matt Landau from VRMB, and this is Unlocked, Season 9, Homerunners. This episode features Michelle Boyle, who also goes by MJ. And MJ is not a drop in the tiny home movement. MJ is the tiny home movement in a drop. We spend a lot of our time interviewing full-size vacation home managers. But when you really think about it, why limit our focus by size? Why limit our scope with labels? MJ is a paradigm breaker in this sense. She started off with one tiny home, but now basically is a spokesperson for that entire industry. MJ also attended our Keystone retreats last month in Tennessee, and there was a very particular moment in which we were discussing the values of professional vacation rental managers. And Mike Harrington, one of the most established leaders in the industry, he said that people like MJ need to be at the table in any professional vacation rental management conversation. The personal discoveries, the grit, the creativity that you'll hear in MJ's story speak to the core of all great hospitality entrepreneurs, and I think they'll resonate with you too. This episode is sponsored by Breezeway, your property care and operations platform, and Point Central, the leaders in smart home automation. As with every episode this season, I asked MJ to kick off by interpreting what homerunners as a phrase means to you.
Homerunner to me is a synonym for mom or mother. My journey into hosting started when my kids moved out of the house. So I was looking at myself and thinking, what am I going to do now? So Homerunner is doing all the things that it takes to run a home. And in my case, it's actually part of my new identity.
I love that. And when I first met you, I have not since stopped telling your story to other people in our industry. And when I describe you, they're always so impressed, but more importantly, surprised. And I'm curious why you think your story surprises people.
So first of all, my story surprises me. Um, I I I didn't set out to be where I am. I just headed off in this general direction. I definitely surprises my parents and my family. I've always been a very scrappy person. I think it maybe surprises people because what I do is, in a large part, what I do is very rebellious. I don't operate inside the box. I question boundaries. I push the edges of the rules. So if people are surprised by what I was or what I have been able to get done, probably because it takes so much time and so much unapologetic work.
Mm. And I'm curious, was there a moment in your career that you realized this rebelliousness and kind of started embracing it, started realizing I'm about to surprise people?
Oh yes, 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 yes. So the story is actually before before I started the hosting part of my career. I was let me see, it was about 10 years ago now. I was working for a housing provider and I invented something. And I accidentally invented it and it ended up being just this really amazing product and amazing journey. And
Can we tell them what you invented?
yes, I'll tell you absolutely. So it ended up being this really amazing story, an amazing journey, but I came out on the other end and I'll tell you what it is in a moment. I came out on the other end of the experience realizing I don't have to work in a cubicle for someone else and depend on them for my future to make money to secure. Like I was giving 125% to my job to my career, to my employer. And then I figured out, wait a minute. I can give them what they need and what they want and what they expect, but I'm giving them too much. I'm not giving enough to myself. So I am the accidental inventor of bed bug resistant furniture.
And when you said that, I think I spent like a minute looking into the mountains, processing exactly what that meant. But it's basically exactly what it sounds like. And it's a patent that then allowed people who used this invention um, to use your discovery across all of their beds, couches, anything else.
So the product itself is actually called the bed. There are several different configurations, including tables and various forms of bed: queen bed, bunk bed, single bed,
Okay.
that kind of thing, as well as bedside tables predominantly. So without going too far into the technological weeds, um, bed bugs are attracted by CO2, right? They're attracted by your pheromones that you create while you sleep. So 98% of bed bug infestations start in the bed and in the bedroom area. So my invention was noteworthy, because no one had ever thought, and this is probably a theme, right? No one had ever thought of designing furniture with that goal in mind, number one. And then number two, it's really been very effective because um, they're easy to find, they're easy to treat, they're easy to inspect. And so that's enough about that.
And so you invented this thing while you were working at this company, but it was kind of the jujitsu move that you did on the company and the industry that kind of put you into the driver's seat. What was that little epiphany?
So they and everyone, even including myself, again, it was an accidental invention, and they didn't realize that what I had kind of invented. So there was various, experts brought in and said, "Wow, is this really, is this really what we think it is?" And so they and everybody assumed that they, by proxy, for lack of a better term, owned then the patent.
Because you were working for them at the time.
Because I was working for them, right? It was their money, it was their computer, it was their time. And so, to make a long and super wonderful story short, we eventually came to an agreement where they would be able to use it and to sell it. And then I have the glorious opportunity to continue to reap the rewards of that effort.
And was that instinct just, I mean, I'm guessing it entailed hiring legal services. Was that just your moment when you decided to dig your heels in and really value this thing that you had built?
Yes, but remember, I've already said the word once, and this is this rebellious nature.
Hmm.
It's the I've never been negatively rebellious before, I guess. But yes, so I mean, it meant standing up for myself. It meant pushing outside my comfort zone. It meant obviously giving up my job and my financial security, literally. So to say nope, nope, this is no, this is this is mine, and I'm gonna fight for the rights, and I'm going to push beyond my comfort zone, and yeah, stand my ground.
Hmm. And so that kind of leads us into where your vacation rental career begins. Um, Back in 2015, your kids are graduating high school, heading off to college. You are a single mom. And this first tiny home, was that inspired by anything in particular? Had you been thinking, I want to build a tiny home? How did it come about?
So the term necessity is the mother of invention is cannot possibly be more true than it is in my life. So when they physically moved out of, when they're physically moving out of my house, I turned to face my proverbial future and had kind of a mini panic attack. So I had set them up for their future, a great education and a car and an apartment and their college, and really set them up really well for their future. But really realized suddenly that I had zero for myself. So no savings account, no 401k, no assets to speak of, no real estate, nothing. And so I knew, crap, I have to do something, and I have to do it fast because I'm getting old and I'm older, and I'm not going to be able to, pivot and so I kind of had this kind of oh crap moment. So the idea of the first tiny house that I still live in, the idea of the first tiny house was, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is significantly reduce my living expenses by building a tiny house, by living in a tiny house, putting it on some rented land, a loose spot in the woods kind of a thing. That was the vision. And my living expenses went from, $1,800 a month just for rent to less than, it's people find it incredible, but it's really true. Um, Less than $100 a month total living expenses, including utilities, water, Wi-Fi, insurance, and the whole nine yards. So significantly reduced my living expenses so that I could figure out how to then either save or reinvest or what now to do with my corporate income, right? That would better set me up for the future.
And what I love so much about that is in times of uncertainty, it can be very helpful and productive to focus only on the things that we can control. And in your case, you are literally lowering the bar of what you need in order to make the most of what you have. And I think this leads into your first big sort of leap with the home. What happened with regards to recognition?
It was really stunning. It was super stunning. So the tiny house, my tiny house that I live in, I didn't know anything about designing or building. And I did about, I don't know, 60 to 70% of the work itself, electrical and plumbing and flooring and roofing, and I mean, um and the design itself, I also did 100% by myself. I have to say that's the super fun part. That's the building the playhouse, decorating the playhouse kind of concept that I really, really loved. So, my tiny house was finished in 2015, and in 2016, House Beautiful magazine declared it the fourth most popular one of the year.
And were you excited when you saw that? They reach out and said, "Congrats."
Yes, I was excited and I was stunned because, again, when you I don't know, maybe it was in the right place at the right time. It definitely was the beginning of the wave of the popularity of tiny houses, and the tiny house shows kind of started to blow up, and there wasn't a lot of, I'm kind of downplaying the accolades at this point, but it truly was incredible that I get accolades, I get, recognition and reinforcement inside the tiny house industry, but to have such a mainstream publication, such a broadly, distributed and such a respected publication, to it was stunning. It was awesome. I mean, it was super great. It's super great.
And the tiny home industry, as you put it, I don't think I've ever heard that phrase before because I'm not familiar enough with it. And I don't think the majority of our listeners are either. It is a whole world, right? It's a universe.
Oh yes, it's like any niche. It's very similar to any niche industry or or hobby or project, right? And so the people that are in and around the tiny house movement, we're all very, very, very passionate, very, very driven, and appreciate the the lesser, having less and experiencing more. Yeah, it's pretty big. It's definitely gotten bigger again. 2014, 15. So in 2014, I attended the first ever tiny house industry event ever in the entire world. And it was an interesting event. Quick story. So they asked me to come down and be the keynote on one day and then be the master of ceremonies on another day. I'd done some speaking and I've done some speech competitions and Toastmasters, and so they asked me to come down. It was in Colorado Springs, and they were expecting about 5,000 people, and it was at the mining museum, and they were expecting about 5,000 people, but it was a free event, right? So it was paid for by the sponsors, and flew down there. And the day before the event, their website crashed because they had over 10,000 people. So even though it was a free event, of course, you have to sign up, and then at the front gate, you get your wrist. And so they had over 10,000 people that had signed up as of the day before. They were on the news that morning, and they were expecting 5,000 people total over 5 days. And they had over 65,000 people.
Oh my gosh. How did all these people fit?
Exactly. There was like six of us running the show, six or seven of us like running the show. We ran out. It was actually, I mean, it was, it was so horrible. I mean, so awesome and so wonderful and so horrible. There are those of us in the industry that still are like, oh my God, do you remember? I mean, that obviously there weren't enough porta potties. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough water. Actually, the traffic on the highway, which because the museum is next to the highway, was backed up all the way to Denver. I mean, it, so that was the start actually of the modern day tiny house movement, was that event. And it was stunning and it was wonderful. And definitely that kickstarted, everything else that's happened.
And it kickstarted also your industry event attendance. And I've also seen you at vacation rental, more broadly speaking, industry events. What advice do you have for folks who haven't attended a conference just yet?
I think my advice is to take the time, make the time, invest the money. To me, they're kind of part vacation, part work. I'm always very surprised by what I come away with. So, my advice for people that don't typically attend conferences, even if you think it doesn't apply to you, even if you think that you've got it all figured out, it's still so incredibly valuable to meet the people and to expand what you know about, or what you think about the industry that you're participating in.
I think so often that first industry event across all verticals represents something of an inflection point for the first time attendee. Can look back on that first event and really pinpoint the moment that your business started getting more um, professional, started growing. And that event for you, because mind you, listener, up until now, Michelle is still only living in her tiny home, sort of triggered an experiment in short term rentals, right? And what was that first short term rental tiny home like?
So the concept of the first one was, I have a tiny house that I'm living in that has significantly decreased my living expenses. Check that box, check that check box. Now I wonder if I could use a tiny house to significantly increase my income on the other side, right? And so I live on a retired Christmas tree farm, and I was walking down in the farm one day, down in the lower section, we're gonna call it, and there's this wire, just like this random wire sticking up out of the ground, and next to what's called a freeze-proof standpipe, or what they call a field hydrant, which is basically just a water spigot in the middle of a field. And so I talked to the landowners, and I said, "What's up with that like wire sticking out of the ground?" And they said, "Well, we were going to build a Santa's cabin down in the Christmas tree, lot down there, and people would then be able to get their axes and pay their money, and and that would be kind of like the gateway to the farm. And then we never ended up doing it, but they had pulled the water and the power down to the forest, of course. And I said, well, I have this idea. I'm thinking about building a tiny house, and why don't we put it like right there? Because the wiring's there, the water's there. I'm going to call up my sponsors. We'll build a tiny house, just really small. It's 148 square feet, and we'll put it down there. And let's see, totally as an experiment, let's see if this is something that people would want to do. Because I have no idea whether or not people would A, want to come stay in a tiny house, B, they want to come stay in a tiny house by themselves in the middle of the woods. I didn't know anything about hosting or Airbnb, and like nothing about nothing. It was just strictly, totally 100% experience. But I was doing what I love to do. I built it. I started on a piece of paper, graph paper with a pencil. I designed it on paper. My boyfriend, built it as far as the framing and the siding. We transferred it from his house to here. Total experiment. But I was doing what I absolutely love, decor and the photo shoots and just totally an experiment.
And you mentioned you called up your sponsors. And I'm curious because I think a lot of people have built up a network, and in a lot of cases, a network of individuals that like them, trust them, and maybe have access to capital. What is the difference between how do you call up your sponsors? What is that?
So when I built my tiny house that I live in, I started the project with $0, literally not any money in the bank. And I stumbled on this book that was written by a friend of mine in the tiny house industry called Your Message Here. And it was basically the concept of leveraging what NASCAR does, right, for the tiny house industry. When you really start to break it down, however, it's basically it's kind of a glorified term for calling your uncle who runs a hardware store, who has a scratched sink in his back room that he's willing to give you for your tiny house. Now, it's a little bit more hustle than that when you actually start to have sponsors, of course, and then later on a podcast. And but basically it's just to go to these companies and say, hey, Sherwin-Williams, for instance, like there's this new industry. It's the tiny house industry. Most people haven't heard of it. Everybody wanted to know what a tiny house was at the time. And I'm building this tiny house, and I'd like to, can you give me the paint or the stain that I need to build this tiny house? And then I'm going to put your name on all of my marketing and all my social media. And if someone wants to know what color it is or where I got it or how I applied it, then I now become kind of this walking, talking spokesman for Sherwin-Williams Paint Company. And that's anyway, and I took that concept and just blew it up, for lack of a better term. So I had contacted, and there's a whole probably podcast behind this subject, but I contacted about 200 different companies. My first build, I had 22 corporate sponsors, including national sponsors like Lowe's and American Standard and Sherwin Williams. And then, so for my first rental, what I meant by calling my sponsors was they had already experienced success, obviously, right? The house that they sponsored was got these accolades in House Beautiful magazine. So for the second tiny house, it's like, okay, can I have a couple more gallons of paint? Can I have some more lumber or a few more windows?
What goes through your head in terms of how you present an offer? I'm guessing it's something like, here are the things that I need in order to execute my vision. Some of the things might be actual products like paint. Other things might be money. I'm just thinking beyond your specific example. And then you go to the person who possesses that resource and you package the offer in a way that appeals to their one of their greater objectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Every one of my sponsors had a different objective. Some of them didn't have And it sounds like quote unquote so long ago, but some of them had no social media presence at all. They didn't have a blog. Or I did some guest blogging for some of my sponsors, and so some of them, they just wanted me to talk nice about them on Facebook. Some of them wanted me to write for their blog. Some of them, they American Standard again, they actually sent out their own photographer, their own document team, to make sure that my houses were on Houzz, again, talking about their products in this industry, really in particular, which again, I think that was part of it too. Like, this is a new industry, get in on the ground floor. So yeah, it's all about packaging it for what they want and what they need.
And I would also add, in my own experience working with sponsors, at the beginning, you kind of have to try a bunch of stuff and be okay with the fact that you might not get any responses if you haven't built clout or a proven track record just yet. But as you build that reputation, it becomes increasingly important to be very specific about what you are willing to offer, the lengths to which you are willing to go, and very clear about the things that you're not willing to do, the things that you're not able to get creative with. Because soon enough, if you've got a big enough, most influential sponsor, it begins to affect your direction.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I have to also, kind of talk about this time versus money vortex we all have, right? And at that point in time, I had nothing but time. And so, it was a really mutually beneficial that these companies would, for a relatively very small investment, could make such a huge impact on my life, my business, my future. Um, and yeah, so you really, then you get to the point where you get busy enough. Now you have less time and more money, so you become much more possessive of your boundaries. And at this point in time, especially, time is my best asset. So back then I had nothing but time, and now I have almost none.
And now a word from our sponsors. Point Central provides smart property solutions for smart vacation property managers. They help streamline operations, protect the property, and enhance the guest experience using keyless access. Why? Because guests are tired after traveling, duh. And being able to go directly to that property with keyless access instead of stopping at a manager's office, this is no longer a luxury. This is a standard practice. Plus, everybody loves avoiding extra trips due to lost keys, not to mention the constant cost of rekeying. Point Central partners stay aware with an activity log of who enters and leaves the property, which helps keep track of cleaning and maintenance crews as well. You can also gain control of your utility bills with their smart thermostats. Schedule set points so guests won't be able to drastically raise or lower the temperatures, for instance. You can ensure the temperature stays consistent when the unit is vacant. Prevent costly maintenance projects caused by water leaks, mold, or HVAC issues with real-time alerts that allow you to be proactive. Visit pointcentral.com/VRMB to learn more. And Breezeway, whose property care and operations platform helps you coordinate, communicate, and verify the detailed work and deliver the best service experience to your guests. With tools for intelligent task scheduling, quality assurance, real-time work coordination, guest messaging, supplies management, owner reporting, and more, oh my! Breezeway helps thousands of short-term rental managers and hospitality operators increase your operational efficiency and eliminate hours of manual work. This allows you to boost your service revenue. It was created by the founding team of FlipKey, which was since acquired by TripAdvisor, and Breezeway is just elevating the experience at every property they touch. Visit breezeway.io/VRMB and get implementation fees waived. That's a $1,000 value right there. Okay, let's get back to the show. And you continue building these tiny houses and eventually find this property. Your first property was a retired Christmas tree farm. Second property was a retired cannabis operation. This represents kind of like the next big leap or twist, right?
Yes. So I always knew that where I started the village was not going to be a forever home. So once I started to realize that I had the resources to be able to look, I started looking for land, for property, and I had a really specific checklist. And then last year, almost exactly a year ago from today, last year I found my dream property, three waterfront acres, with a nightmare of a house, shop that was just horrible, horrible, but affordable and really fit my vision.
And at that point, you were managing slash owning how many homes?
Five tiny houses on wheels. So the five rentals, those five rentals, and then I'd also pivoted a bit to include mobile rentals. The RV rental industry is fairly new. Again, here I am getting into a new industry. Um, I ran out of space to put tiny houses, but I wasn't done. So I pivoted and I have five tiny houses on wheels. And as of last year, also five teardrop rentals, teardrop recreational vehicles.
And I think you just threw in this huge idea casually, but placing the tiny homes on wheels, it opens up all these options with regards to a future. Are those wheels kind of like in a microcosm your broader flexibility philosophy?
People think that that I'm people have thought that I was a little bit crazy the whole time. Like how like I have poured, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and all this money into this wheeled empire. And yes, I mean it I guess, we'd have to go into the broader psychology, and my backstory and all that fun stuff. But I never really had a really steady, secure home, married twice, divorced twice. Like, so home to me no longer meant or means finding a spot in which you will stay forever, because I've never had that luxury. It's never, no matter how many times I've tried, it has always ended up being a fool's errand. So psychologically, financially, strategically, homes on wheels, RVs, a business, my RV business, RV rental business is on wheels. You could literally do that business from anywhere in anybody's parking lot. Became almost a core part of not just who I am, but we'll call it the best part of my business model.
Mhm. And we're going to touch on in a moment the consequences of that kind of investment, specifically. And I'm thinking more broadly for our guests, what happens when your livelihood is threatened due to unfair regulation. But after purchasing that property on the water, you decided that something bigger was happening here and you memorialized it by changing the name of your company. Can you walk us through that decision?
So we talked briefly earlier about attending your first event, your first industry event. And so December of last year, I attended my first hosting event, the Women's Summit in New Orleans. And my company name on my tax returns, and literally since the mid 80s, it's again crazy backstory. I had this company called MJ Enterprises. And so I went to this industry event in December in New Orleans. And of course there's that question, what do you do? Right. And my elevator speech is, I have this company, it's MJ Enterprises. I have three companies underneath. I have My Tiny House Village, I have Oregon Teardrop Rentals, I have My Tiny Creekside Retreat. And at this point, every single person that you talk to, their eyes glaze over and they lose focus. And it's very difficult to get them to understand the function and the business and kind of how it all works together, but they're all separate. And so I came away from that industry event, and this one woman reached out to me and said, whatever you do, you have to change your business name, because you can still tell the IRS whatever you want to tell them what you're called, but you need to lean in more than you've ever leaned in before to what it is that you do, what makes you unique. And everybody said, like, whoa, like nobody that I've ever talked to or have ever talked to does what you do. Lean into that. And so, a lot of soul searching, a lot of domain name searching, and I pivoted from a branding perspective, and my new company name is Unique Northwest Vacation Rentals.
And I think that's also great advice for somebody who may be listening and say, I can't change the name. I've got all this brand equity and all that. It can also be a tagline or a mission statement that you realize one day you need as your umbrella, your magnetic north under which you do all these things. And I love Unique Northwest Vacation Rentals. It's really truly limited edition in the sense that you are and what you have built. And this was this year, 2022. You have one last kind of, I think, leap or milestone before I want to get into some of the lessons. And that was the trigger that a lot of people in our space eventually pull in retiring from your what was previously full-time corporate job. What happened? What was the moment?
So, since 2014 and well before COVID, as a condition of my employment, so also I have worked a full-time remote corporate job through all of this. And, you know, and so that was also a huge obligation. And so throughout all of this, the whole plan, however, again, this long-term strategy was to eventually reduce my dependence on my corporate income, because I knew that corporate America was going to do what corporate America was going to do. I could no longer put all of my eggs in that basket. I could no longer put all of 125% of my time and energy into their business and their strategy and their future. So, post COVID, however, again, I've always worked remote since 2014. But post COVID, there became a lot of pressure, especially for publicly traded companies that I was working for, to come up with their new remote work policies. And so they came out with this new remote work policy and said, you can no longer work remote. And that was the moment. That was it. Because there's no way for me to be able to continue to straddle and run my company and do my job. Now, the truth is I didn't know how I was going to be able to do it. Anyways, people ask me on a day-to-day basis how I do what I do, and I have no idea. I put one step in front of another. I look at what I have to do today. Every once in a while, I look forward and make sure I'm still headed in the right direction. So it was time. The good news is that my side hustle has been making more than my corporate job since 2019. So I was prepared for that. And okay, thank you very much, but I can't return to the office. So I retired.
Congratulations, first of all. Smooth sailing from there on out.
No. That's the funny thing. I mean, that's what life has taught me. It never is.
Right. And you kind of have to ebb and flow. I want to talk about this big move in a second, but someone recently asked me a question. A business consultant asked me, what must you stop doing in terms of your work load in order to make progress on your deeper purpose? And he completely startled me with that question. And it took me plenty of time to think it through. And I'm not expecting you to have the perfect answer just now, but was stopping working in corporate America that final activity, do you think?
1,000%, yes.
Mm-hmm.
1,000% yes. I have, when throughout this journey, and when you live in a tiny house, this is part of living in the tiny house. You are very in tune with your environment. You're very in tune with what do I need? What do I want? Where am I going? And the I have not their mission has not aligned with my values in a very long time. And so leaning into my values was meant giving up the comfort, the security, the reliability of income in pursuit of my authentic self, in pursuit of living my life on my rules, ironically, um, and really leaning into my values.
And when you speak with somebody who's maybe finds themselves in still that predicament, is trying to get to the point of freedom that you just described, is a big step just articulating what those values are. I feel like a lot of us kind of know it, but until we etch it into stone or at least a piece of paper above our desk, it's hard to use it as a weapon in our defense.
So two things come to mind, I think, out of everything you just said. Hard. This there is absolutely nothing easy about what I do. It is hard, physical, time consuming, emotional work. But then I'm also going to circle back to what we started talking about, and that is necessity is the mother of invention. When we hit that spot, and maybe it's a low spot, it normally is a low spot, right? It's actually something that forces us. It's something that's forcing us, right? Something that's pushing against us, right? We are headed in a particular direction. We have something that's pushing against us. It's normally that push that forces you to say, okay, am I going to push back, or am I going to pivot and go in the direction I'd rather go, or rather be, the place I'd rather be, rather than push against this resistance?
And how much of the courage to pull that trigger and go against the pushing do you think comes from having what sounds to me like a really clear master vision of what you want to do with your life? Is that a necessary step, or kind of like we started off talking about at the beginning, do you just kind of bumble along and stay alert and aware and develop that master plan as you go?
Um, First of all, I would say definitely having a master plan is never going to take the sting or the anxiety, or in my case, even the emotional reaction to that pivot, right? It's always going to have some, it's always going to be uncomfortable. But for me, I think it's trusting that my ultimate vision, I have it, it's in my head. It's been in my head for years. I have, again, that's that head down work, day to day, just drive, hustle, hustle, work. And then every once in a while, look up, proverbially, emotionally, physically, financially, look up and go, okay, am I still headed in this right direction? Yep. Okay. Put your head back down and then keep working. So, yes, having the strategy in place, it doesn't have any, you're not guaranteed anything, but it definitely helps take the sting, and sort of help to reinforce that what you're doing is the right thing. You're headed the right direction.
And it does that come from, I think a lot of people have never really been confronted with the question, what would my dream life, what would my dream work look like? Does it come from sitting down with yourself? You said soul searching and being honest and maybe a little unrealistic, even, and saying, what would my dream life look like?
Yeah, and that the answer to that question actually goes back even further, about 10 years ago, when I started to say, okay, what do I want to do in retirement? And then I said, okay, what do I like to do? I like to talk and I like to travel. So my dream retirement, right, is traveling where people are going to pay me to come talk to them.
I love it.
And that was like 10 years ago, maybe even 12 years ago now. And so I joined Toastmasters to figure out whether or not public speaking was my gig. And then, of course, then the next question is, well, what am I going to talk about? And so then I had to come up with this important life, or I had to come up with something to talk about. Obviously, I had to provide value. You know, so that, yeah, so the answer to that question even goes back even a little bit further and even a little bit more broadly, and that is, um, once everything quote unquote gets settled, and I'm not really quite sure that my life ever will, but once everything gets settled, again, even the broader stepping back 3 or 4 more steps and looking forward, that's the ultimate, to me, that's the ultimate retirement, is having gone through this experience and then having the blessed opportunity to, to share it with others.
And in our industry, we often talk about companies that have been building sustainably, building their brand in a consistent way, providing great hospitality experiences and improving over time. Sustainability goes into all these different aspects. And when you're doing these things right, when adversity strikes, it's not going to be easy, but at the very least, you have built up something of a foundation, some tools or support structures you can lean on to ride through threats and adversity in ways that companies that weren't as methodical or strategic can do. And I'd like for you to share what happened 2 weeks ago, and if that framing that I just provided holds up.
Um, so this is the emotional part, right? So about 2 weeks ago, um, which it's always been that looming threat. It's always been something that I knew was going to happen. I knew that by leasing land for the tiny house village, that by putting my eggs again, right, in someone else's basket, that there was always risk associated with that part of the business. So when I bought the property, I wanted to make sure that it was big enough, and that it would maybe someday eventually house the tiny house village as well. 2 weeks ago, however, I found out that I have to move the entire village by October 1st. So I think it's 80 days and counting now, to relocate what has been my breadwinner, or my bread making operation, right? The money making operation that has supported the rest of the operations, and so now, yeah, I've got 80 days to move 6 tiny houses on wheels 85 miles.
And what was the impetus there? Is this a regulatory thing or have to do with the land owner?
It is a regulatory thing, but so about, I think, 3 years ago, the county said, we think that you have tiny houses that you're renting out, and as such, that's against the rules. So they said, how many tiny homes do you have? And I said, well, what's the county definition of a tiny home? And they bumbled around, and then they said, well, we don't have one. And I'm like, okay, well, y'all circle back with me
I love it.
and let me know when you can answer that question, and then we'll have a more, we'll have a different conversation.
Which I love, by the way. Most people would just say, I got 6 or I got 10. But I loved how you've got very clear on what is the definition. You let me know. You get back to me.
Well, and a part of it, again, I talked about the rebellious, right? And I'm not, again, so part of it, this is where I get to brag a bit. So I own the smallest Airbnb accommodation on the West Coast, in arguably the smallest. And so now when I go to industry events, and I've been to a few now, it actually is my nickname. And so one of my quote unquote tiny houses on wheels that I rent out on Airbnb is 48 square feet. It doesn't have a bathroom. It doesn't have a kitchen. It doesn't have and so to me, yeah, and it's kind of a bit of tongue in cheek, obviously. But so when the county comes along and says, well, you have tiny houses on wheels, it's like, okay, great. What's a tiny house on wheels? Because nobody would envision defining that as a tiny house. And so if they're going to say you have to move your tiny houses, well, I don't think this is like, anyway. So that's my kind of
Like what kind of car are you driving? Well, that's a tiny house,
exactly.
right?
Well, and also, to me, it was also a bit of advocacy at the same time, right? It's like, wait a minute. You are, you want me to move this operation because of your definition of what it is. And I'm actually pushing them, even themselves, to define what it is. Interestingly enough, the side effect of that was by pushing and advocating, being an advocate. If you go on the county website, they actually list My Tiny House Village as one of the best and most popular and ideal accommodations actually in the county. And the county themselves have actually sent people to stay here. They've actually paid me to house their employees and their travelers and their social influencers that they have brought to the county to do their PR. So it was very surprising that when 2 weeks ago, I got again a phone call and they said, we told you what you were doing was, and I'm like, I thought this was all resolved years ago because your county thinks I'm the bee's knees, but apparently not. So there was someone new in the zoning department, long story short, that basically has decided that she is going to hang her proverbial career cap on the resolution, of this quote unquote violation.
So this is where I think great vacation rental professionals really shine, is when something comes up that threatens the livelihood of the business in ways that most entrepreneurs, I don't think, could handle. I think this makes us home runners such a special breed. And you had been putting all this thought into building the business in a way that was flexible, in a way that was configurable. And you now, faced with the most threatening news that a vacation rental business could have, that it's illegal, you get to benefit from the fruits of all that labor and simply move them onto this waterfront property. So I guess I get to do the bragging for you now, because it wasn't an accident. It was so thoughtfully put together and built, which I don't think requires genius. I do think you are genius, but I do think it requires a constant awareness, or at least discussions with other leaders, other competitors. How are they handling it? What great ideas are they working on? And it does pay off in ways that you could have never imagined. Um, from the very first tiny home that you built for yourself, you're still living there, right?
Yes.
To this payoff of growing the brand, to slight pivoting the brand onto a new plot of land. What you've built is kind of the ultimate lifestyle business that allows you to do what you love, to get paid for it, and the freedom to change things should you need to. Is this something in your eyes, this outcome, this perfect sort of conditions to enjoy yourself, something that anybody in our space could achieve?
Yes. with enough conviction, enough focus, and noticed that I didn't say money. It really takes, yes, it takes conviction and focus and strategizing and really, really deep introspection, right? What is it that I want? Where am I going? What direction? What do I need? Who do I need on my team? Money's the last part. Money's the last thing you think about. What you, yes, making sure that you're, going back to the definition of home runner, going back to my definition of being a mom, right? Part of being a parent, part of being a home runner is always making sure that you're a successful one, making sure you're always 2.5 steps ahead of the next issue or the next problem. Your child has homework, it's due in a couple of days, rather than waiting till that morning to remind them, right? You're like, hey, what about that thing? What about that thing I know is coming? What about that thing that I know you need help with or I need help with? And not procrastinating. And so it's about, again, knowing where you're going, circling back, staying focused. And then the money comes last. The money's the last part of the equation. Obviously, very important. It's hugely important. But there's so many other steps that have to happen in the meantime. Understanding your environment, understanding the risks that you're taking, leaning into those risks, and the SWOT analysis, which is the corporatized version of everything I've been talking about. Yeah, it's possible. It's tough though. I never want to come across as someone that sounds like a victim. Like, like I could spin it and say, oh my God, this is being done to me. Oh my gosh. And, dramatic hand to the forehead gesture. But it's definitely really, really, really hard, but it feels good in my core. It feels good. And I think everybody deserves that level of comfort in the midst of anxiety.
What an inspirational note to end on. I recently heard an analogy that running a vacation rental business is like jumping into a rushing river. The current will carry you, and it may carry you fast. And if you're not careful, you might crash into a boulder, or worse, if you're not prepared, you might drown. There's no use trying to swim upstream, and you can always go off to the side and get out. But if you choose to navigate the ebbs and flows, you too can maneuver somewhere spectacular. You can do this on your terms. I like to envision MJ as the captain in her own floating tiny house ship, with that captain's hat and one of those old school wooden steering wheels. MJ's shouting out zingers at people on the shore. Smooth sailing all the time, MJ's story is not. But fun, spontaneous, precise, sharp, passionate, these are the features that guide MJ and that guide all of us in great adventures. After all, that's something we can all get excited about. If this episode resonated with you, consider joining us, along with 1,000 plus vacation rental owners and managers in VRMB communities. Together with some of the most thoughtful and creative colleagues in our industry, you can build your business on your terms. You can sign up at vrmb.com/join. Until next time.
Like it's taking its time, 'cause I'm momentarily